Charles had always been a man who loved the finer things in life. Born into a wealthy family, he never had to worry about money. His days were filled with luxury vacations, high-end shopping sprees, and dining at the world's most exclusive restaurants. But for all his wealth, Charles often felt something was missing. He craved excitement, something that would make him stand out even more in a world where standing out was already his norm. One sunny morning, Charles decided it was time for a new adventure. He packed his bags and boarded a private jet headed to London, a city he had visited many times before, but never truly explored. This time, however, he promised himself he would do things differently. No guided tours or fancy hotels, just him, his camera, and an insatiable curiosity for everything London had to offer. As soon as he landed, Charles wasted no time diving into the heart of the city. He wandered through bustling streets lined with red phone booths, historic pubs, and street performers entertaining wide-eyed tourists. But nothing captured his attention quite like Buckingham Palace. The grandeur of the building was breathtaking, but what really fascinated Charles were the royal guards stationed outside. Their bright red uniforms, tall bearskin hats, and perfectly synchronized movements seemed almost surreal. Charles couldn't help but marvel at how still they stood, unmoving despite the constant chatter and clicking cameras around them. It was as if they weren't human at all but statues carved from discipline and duty. For a moment, Charles felt a strange sense of admiration for these men who could maintain such composure under the watchful eyes of thousands of visitors every day. But admiration quickly turned into mischief. Charles had always been someone who thrived on attention, and now, surrounded by fellow tourists, snapping photos and whispering in awe, he felt an irresistible urge to entertain, not just himself, but everyone around him. An idea began forming in his mind, one that made him chuckle softly to himself. What if he could break the guards' stoic demeanor? Surely, a little harmless fun wouldn't hurt anyone. With this thought buzzing in his head, Charles left the palace grounds and headed to a nearby art supply store. He browsed the aisles until he found exactly what he needed: a small bottle of bright blue paint. The color was bold, impossible to ignore. As he paid for it, the shopkeeper gave him a curious look, but Charles simply smiled and said, "You'll see." Back at the palace, the crowd had grown larger. Tourists jostled for the perfect photo spot, while children pointed excitedly at the guards. Charles positioned himself near the front, gripping the bottle of paint tightly in his hand. His heart raced with anticipation, but there was no turning back now. He told himself it was just a prank, something to make people laugh, and maybe earn him a few likes on social media. Little did he know, this single act would spiral into consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. As Charles approached the royal guard, his confidence grew with each step. The guard stood tall and motionless, his face expressionless beneath the towering bearskin hat. To Charles, it almost felt like a challenge, a test to see if he could provoke even the slightest reaction from someone trained to remain completely unshaken. The crowd around him buzzed with energy, snapping pictures and chatting excitedly about the iconic sight before them. Little did they know, they were about to witness something far more memorable and controversial than anything they had expected. Charles glanced around, ensuring all eyes were on the guards. He wanted an audience. After all, what good was a prank if no one saw it? With a mischievous grin spreading across his face, he uncapped the bottle of bright blue paint. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Was this really a good idea? But just as quickly as the thought came, he pushed it aside. "It's just paint," he muttered under his breath. "No harm done." Before anyone could react, Charles tilted the bottle and poured the thick, vivid liquid over the guard's pristine red uniform. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the paint dripped down the front of the jacket, staining the fabric in streaks of electric blue. Some people gasped in shock, while others laughed nervously, unsure whether to take the situation seriously. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing every second of the spectacle. Charles stepped back, laughing loudly as if he had just pulled off the greatest joke in history. But the guard didn't move, not even a twitch. His posture remained rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as though nothing unusual had happened. This only fueled Charles' amusement. "Come on, buddy," he called out, clapping his hands together. "You can crack a smile, can't you?" Still, there was no response. It was as if the guard wasn't even human, but some sort of machine programmed to ignore everything around him. The crowd began to murmur among themselves. While some found Charles' antics amusing, others shook their heads in disapproval. One elderly woman turned to her companion and said, "That poor man is just doing his job. Why would anyone do such a thing?" Nearby, a father covered his young son's eyes, muttering that it wasn't right to disrespect someone who served their country. Charles, however, was oblivious to the growing tension. All he cared about was the attention, the laughter, the stares, the thrill of being the center of everyone's focus. Security personnel stationed nearby quickly noticed the commotion and sprang into action. Two officers rushed toward Charles, their expressions stern and authoritative. "Sir, step away immediately," one of them commanded, his voice firm. Charles froze for a moment, his smile faltering as reality began to sink in. "What's the big deal?" he stammered, trying to play it off as a harmless joke. "It's just a little paint." But the damage was already done. The once cheerful atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The crowd parted as the officers escorted Charles away, leaving behind a trail of whispers and judgmental glances. As he was led off the premises, Charles caught a glimpse of the guard he had targeted. Still standing perfectly still, the guard seemed untouched by the chaos unfolding around him. For the first time since arriving in London, Charles felt a pang of unease. Had he gone too far? Little did he know, the repercussions of his actions were only beginning. What started as a reckless attempt to entertain himself was about to spiral into a life-altering ordeal, one that would force him to confront the consequences of his privilege and impulsiveness. As Charles was led away from the scene by the security officers, the weight of what he had done began to settle in. The cheerful laughter that had once filled the air was now replaced with murmurs of disapproval and stern glances. Tourists who had initially chuckled at his antics were now shaking their heads, whispering about how disrespectful and inappropriate his actions had been. Some even recorded videos, capturing not just the prank itself, but also Charles' reaction as he was taken into custody. By the time they reached the security office inside Buckingham Palace, Charles' earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Inside the room, the atmosphere was tense. The officers asked for his identification, and Charles reluctantly handed over his passport. As they jotted down his details, one officer looked up at him with a cold expression. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" he asked, his tone sharp and unyieldingly professional. Charles swallowed hard, trying to muster a response, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to explain that it was all meant to be a joke, something lighthearted and fun, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. His intentions didn't change the fact that he had crossed a line, a very public and symbolic one. Meanwhile, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media platforms were flooded with posts and videos of Charles pouring paint on the royal guard. Hashtags like #RespectTradition and #RoyalGuardRespect trended worldwide, sparking heated debates. Many condemned Charles for his blatant disregard for tradition and authority, calling him entitled and arrogant. Others defended him, arguing that he was simply an uninformed tourist looking for attention. But no matter which side people took, one thing was clear: Charles had become the center of global outrage. Back home, Charles' family scrambled to deal with the fallout. Reporters camped outside their mansion, shoving microphones through the gates and bombarding them with questions. "What do you think of your son's behavior? Is he usually this reckless?" The constant invasion of privacy left his parents exhausted and embarrassed. His mother, usually so proud of her son's adventurous spirit, sat silently in her study, staring at the endless stream of negative headlines on her phone. Even his younger sister, who idolized him, couldn't bring herself to defend him this time. "He should have known better," she muttered during dinner, her voice tinged with disappointment. As the days passed, Charles remained under police supervision, awaiting formal charges. Confined to a holding cell, he spent most of his time replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the guards' stoic expression, the crowd's shocked faces, and the way the officers had looked at him, as if he were nothing more than a troublemaker. For the first time in his life, Charles felt truly alone. The wealth and privilege that had always shielded him seemed useless now. Money couldn't erase the footage circulating online or repair the damage to his reputation. When the authorities finally released him on bail, Charles returned to his hotel room, where silence greeted him. No staff members smiled politely or offered assistance. Instead, they avoided eye contact altogether. It was as if everyone knew exactly who he was and wanted nothing to do with him. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Charles stared blankly at the wall, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. What had started as a foolish attempt to entertain himself had spiraled into something far greater, an international scandal that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. Though the immediate chaos had subsided, Charles understood that this was only the beginning. The court case loomed ahead, along with the inevitable judgment from both the legal system and society. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, a small part of him hoped, perhaps naively, that somehow he could make things right. But making amends wouldn't be easy, especially when the world was watching and waiting to see what he would do next. The day of Charles' court appearance arrived, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and even a few individuals who had been present at Buckingham Palace during the incident. Cameras flashed outside as Charles stepped out of the car, his head bowed low to avoid the piercing gaze of the crowd. Gone was the confident, carefree man who had poured paint on the royal guard just weeks earlier. In his place stood someone visibly shaken, dressed in a plain suit that hung loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to the luxurious outfits he used to wear. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge, an elderly man with a stern expression, presided over the case. Charles sat beside his lawyer, a high-profile attorney known for handling difficult cases involving wealthy clients. Despite the lawyer's reputation, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of legal expertise could undo the damage he had caused. As the proceedings began, the prosecution laid out their case, presenting evidence that painted Charles' actions as reckless and disrespectful. They showed video footage of the prank, highlighting how it disrupted public order and tarnished the dignity of one of Britain's most revered institutions. Charles listened intently, his hands clasped tightly together. He winced every time the prosecutor emphasized words like disrespect and vandalism. For the first time, he realized the gravity of what he had done. It wasn't just about pouring paint on a uniform. It was about mocking tradition, undermining authority, and embarrassing an entire nation. The weight of these realizations pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. When it was his lawyer's turn to speak, the defense tried to argue that Charles' actions were impulsive and not malicious. "My client is deeply remorseful," the lawyer said, gesturing toward Charles. "He never intended to cause harm or disrespect." This was a momentary lapse in judgment from someone who didn't fully understand the significance of his actions. But the judge didn't seem convinced. His expression remained firm, and his eyes occasionally darted toward Charles, studying him carefully. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Charles was found guilty of public disorder and vandalism. The judge sentenced him to 200 hours of community service, a hefty fine equivalent to thousands of dollars, and a permanent ban from returning to the United Kingdom. "Your actions have consequences," the judge declared, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "Let this be a lesson to you and others who might think they are above respecting the laws and traditions of our society." As the gavel came down, Charles felt a wave of emotions: shock, regret, and humiliation. Outside, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about how he planned to move forward. But Charles didn't answer. Instead, he climbed into the waiting car, his face pale and drawn. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the meaning of accountability. Money couldn't buy him a way out of this mess, and fame only amplified the backlash. Over the following days, the sentence dominated headlines worldwide. Social media users debated whether the punishment was too harsh or too lenient, but one thing was certain: Charles' life would never be the same. Business partners who once eagerly sought his investments now distanced themselves, fearing association with his tarnished image. Friends stopped answering his calls, and invitations to exclusive events dried up completely. Even his family struggled to reconcile their love for him with the shame his actions had brought upon them. Alone in his hotel room, Charles replayed the judge's words in his mind. Let this be a lesson. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but deep down, he also knew he had to change. The question was whether he could find the strength to rebuild his life, or if the weight of his mistakes would crush him entirely. The weeks following the trial were some of the loneliest and most humbling of Charles' life. Stripped of his usual distractions, luxury vacations, high-profile parties, and endless socializing, he found himself grappling with a silence he had never experienced before. Back in his hometown, Charles moved into a modest apartment, far removed from the sprawling mansion where he had grown up. His family, though supportive in their own way, kept their distance, unsure of how to bridge the gap between love and disappointment. Friends who once surrounded him like moths to a flame now avoided him altogether, whispering behind his back about how he got what he deserved. Charles tried to fill his days with mundane activities, reading books he had never touched before, watching old movies, and taking long walks through quiet parks. But no matter what he did, the memory of that fateful day at Buckingham Palace lingered like a shadow. Every time he saw a red uniform on TV or heard someone mention the royal guards, his stomach churned with guilt. He couldn't escape the image of the guard standing motionless, painted blue, while the world watched and judged. To make matters worse, Charles' financial situation began to spiral downward. The hefty fine imposed by the court had drained a significant portion of his savings, and without active business partnerships or investments coming in, he was forced to cut back drastically on his expenses. For someone accustomed to living lavishly, this sudden shift felt suffocating. Gone were the private jets, designer suits, and extravagant dinners. Instead, Charles learned to shop at local grocery stores and cook meals for himself, a task so foreign to him that it almost felt comical. But the hardest blow came when he realized just how much his actions had damaged his relationships. One evening, Charles decided to visit his parents, hoping to reconnect and perhaps find solace in their presence. When he arrived, however, the tension in the air was palpable. His father barely spoke, burying himself in paperwork, while his mother offered polite but distant conversation. Over dinner, his younger sister finally broke the silence. "Do you even understand why everyone is so upset?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's not just about the paint or the guard. It's about respect. You disrespected people, traditions, and everything we taught you growing up." Her words hit Charles like a punch to the gut, leaving him speechless. Desperate to regain control of his life, Charles turned to the one thing he could still influence: community service. Though initially reluctant, he soon discovered that helping others gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Assigned to work at a local homeless shelter, Charles spent hours serving meals, organizing supplies, and listening to the stories of those less fortunate. At first, he felt out of place, unsure of how to interact with people whose lives were so different from his own. But over time, he began to see them not as strangers, but as individuals with struggles, dreams, and resilience. One person in particular left a lasting impression on him: a woman named Sarah, a volunteer at the shelter who radiated kindness and patience. Unlike others, she didn't judge Charles for his past mistakes. Instead, she encouraged him to focus on the future. During one of their conversations, she said, "Everyone makes mistakes, Charles. What matters is what you do after. Use this as a chance to grow, to become someone better than you were before. Her words struck a chord deep within him, reigniting a flicker of hope he thought had been extinguished. As the weeks passed, Charles threw himself into his work at the shelter, determined to prove, to himself and to the world, that he wasn't the same reckless man who had poured paint on a royal guard. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild fragments of his shattered identity. The process was painful and often overwhelming, but it also brought moments of clarity. For the first time in his life, Charles understood the value of humility, accountability, and genuine human connection. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, he vowed to keep moving forward, one small step at a time. Charles' transformation didn't happen overnight, but the months he spent volunteering at the homeless shelter began to reshape him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new challenges and lessons, forcing him to confront not only his past mistakes, but also the flaws in his character that had led him there. He started waking up early, something he had never done before, to help prepare breakfast for the shelter's residents. At first, it was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but over time, he found a strange kind of fulfillment in serving others. One morning, as Charles handed a plate of food to an elderly man named George, their eyes met briefly. The man smiled warmly and said, "Thank you, son. You've got a good heart." Those simple words stayed with Charles long after George had walked away. For someone who had spent months feeling like the lowest version of himself, hearing such kindness from a stranger felt like a lifeline. It reminded him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about proving you could be better moving forward. Sarah, the volunteer who had become a guiding presence in Charles' life, noticed the change in him too. One afternoon, while they sorted donations together, she asked, "Do you ever think about apologizing directly? To the guard, I mean." Her question caught Charles off guard. He had thought about it countless times, but the idea always felt impossible. How could he apologize to someone whose dignity he had publicly humiliated? What if the guard refused to forgive him, or worse, didn't even acknowledge his apology? But Sarah's words planted a seed in Charles' mind. She encouraged him to write a letter, not because it guaranteed forgiveness, but because it would show that he truly regretted his actions. That night, sitting alone in his small apartment, Charles took out a pen and paper. At first, the words came slowly, hesitant, and unsure. But as he wrote, his thoughts poured onto the page with raw honesty. He admitted his foolishness, expressed deep remorse for disrespecting the guard's role and tradition, and promised to spend the rest of his life making amends, not just to the guard, but to everyone affected by his behavior. The next day, Charles mailed the letter to Buckingham Palace, unsure if it would ever reach its intended recipient. Still, the act of writing it gave him a sense of closure he desperately needed. More importantly, it inspired him to take another step toward rebuilding his life, using his remaining wealth to fund programs promoting cultural awareness and respect. With Sarah's help, he partnered with local organizations to create workshops for tourists visiting historical landmarks. These workshops aim to educate people about the significance of traditions, the importance of respecting local customs, and the impact of thoughtless actions. As word spread about Charles' efforts, some people began to soften their opinions of him. While many still criticized his past behavior, others acknowledged that he was trying to make things right. A few former friends reached out, tentatively reconnecting, though their interactions were cautious and guarded. Even his family noticed the sincerity of his efforts. During a rare family dinner, his mother placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "I'm proud of you, Charles. You're doing the hard work." Despite these small victories, Charles knew he couldn't undo the damage he had caused. The video of him pouring paint on the royal guard continued to circulate online, a permanent reminder of his mistake. Yet instead of letting it drag him down, he used it as motivation to keep pushing forward. Every time someone recognized him or mentioned the incident, he responded with humility, acknowledging his wrongdoing and sharing what he had learned since then. By the end of the year, Charles had established himself as an advocate for responsible tourism and cultural sensitivity. Though the journey was far from easy, he found solace in knowing that he was no longer the same man who had once sought attention through reckless stunts. Instead, he had become someone focused on making a positive difference, even if it meant starting with the smallest acts of kindness. And though forgiveness from the guard remained uncertain, Charles held on to hope that someday, somehow, his apology might reach the person who deserved it most. Weeks turned into months, and Charles continued his efforts to rebuild not just his reputation, but also his character. The letter he had sent to Buckingham Palace weighed heavily on his mind. He often wondered if it had even been read, or if it had been discarded without a second thought. Despite the uncertainty, Charles clung to the hope that his apology might eventually reach the royal guard he had wronged. It wasn't about absolving himself of guilt. It was about taking full responsibility for his actions and showing genuine remorse. One chilly morning, as Charles arrived at the homeless shelter to begin his volunteer shift, he noticed an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of his car. His heart skipped a beat as he picked it up and saw the official seal of Buckingham Palace embossed on the front. For a moment, he stood frozen, unsure whether to feel excited or terrified. Slowly, he opened the envelope with trembling hands and began to read. The letter was brief but carried immense weight. It explained that the royal guard who had been present during the incident had received Charles' apology. While the guard chose not to respond personally, the palace expressed appreciation for Charles' willingness to acknowledge his mistake and seek forgiveness. The final sentence struck Charles the most. True growth comes from learning, and your efforts toward positive change are commendable. Tears welled up in Charles' eyes as he reread the letter several times. Though it wasn't the direct forgiveness he had hoped for, it was enough to validate the hard work he had put into turning his life around. That day, he walked into the shelter with a renewed sense of purpose. When Sarah asked why he seemed different, he simply handed her the letter. Her eyes widened as she read it, and when she looked up at him, there was pride in her expression. "This is huge, Charles," she said softly. "You've come so far." Encouraged by this small victory, Charles decided to take his advocacy efforts to the next level. He began organizing public speaking events at schools and community centers, sharing his story with groups of students and young adults. At first, standing in front of a crowd made him nervous, especially knowing that some people still viewed him as the guy who poured paint on a guard. But as he spoke candidly about his mistakes, his regrets, and the lessons he had learned, he noticed something remarkable. People listened. Many of the students were initially skeptical, whispering jokes or scrolling through their phones. But as Charles delved deeper into his experiences, the isolation, the shame, the slow climb toward redemption, they began to pay attention. One girl raised her hand during a cue and a session and asked, "Do you think you'll ever be able to fix everything you broke?" Charles paused for a moment before answering. "No," he admitted honestly. "Some things can't be fixed, but I can try to make better choices moving forward. And maybe in doing that, I can help prevent others from making the same mistakes I did." His honesty resonated with the audience. Teachers approached him afterward, thanking him for addressing topics like accountability and cultural respect in a way that felt real and relatable. Some students even stayed behind to talk, asking for advice on how to handle their own past mistakes. Charles realized that his story, though painful, had the power to inspire change in others. In addition to speaking engagements, Charles launched a social media campaign called Respect Every Tradition. Through videos, posts, and live discussions, he encouraged travelers to approach new cultures with curiosity and humility rather than entitlement. The campaign gained traction quickly, drawing support from influencers, educators, and even former critics who admired his transformation. For the first time in years, Charles felt like he was contributing something meaningful to the world. Despite these successes, Charles knew his journey wasn't over. Forgiveness, from others and from himself, was a process, not a destination. But as he looked back on how far he had come, He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. He had started as a reckless tourist seeking attention, but now he was someone committed to teaching others the importance of respect and responsibility. And while he would always carry the memory of his biggest mistake, he had finally found a way to use it as a stepping stone toward becoming a better person. Years had passed since that fateful day at Buckingham Palace, and Charles' life bore little resemblance to the one he had once lived. Gone were the days of reckless indulgence and impulsive decisions driven by a desire for attention. In their place stood a man transformed, someone who had faced his mistakes head-on and emerged stronger, wiser, and more grounded than ever before. Though the memory of pouring paint on the royal guard still lingered, it no longer defined him. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far he had come. Charles now spent much of his time traveling, not to luxury destinations or glamorous events, but to schools, community centers, and cultural landmarks around the world. His speeches about accountability, respect, and personal growth resonated deeply with audiences of all ages. He spoke openly about his past, sharing not just the embarrassing details of his infamous prank, but also the painful aftermath, the isolation, the legal consequences, and the long road to redemption. People listened intently, often approaching him afterward to share their own stories of struggle and transformation. To Charles, these moments were priceless, a testament to the fact that his journey could inspire others to reflect on their own lives. One afternoon, while speaking at a university in London, Charles received an unexpected invitation. A representative from Buckingham Palace reached out, asking if he would be willing to participate in a private event honoring individuals who promoted cultural awareness and mutual respect. At first, Charles hesitated. The thought of returning to the very place where his downfall had begun filled him with anxiety. But after some encouragement from Sarah and his family, he accepted the invitation, seeing it as an opportunity to close a chapter of his life that had remained unresolved. The event was held in a grand hall within the palace grounds. As Charles walked through the ornate corridors, memories flooded back. The clicking cameras, the shocked faces of bystanders, the stoic expression of the guard he had wronged. For a brief moment, he considered turning around and leaving. But then he reminded himself why he was there, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge it and show how he had grown because of it. During the ceremony, Charles was invited to say a few words. Standing before an audience that included members of the royal family, dignitaries, and representatives from various cultural organizations, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I stand here today not as someone proud of my actions, but as someone humbled by them," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of emotion behind it. "What I did years ago was disrespectful, selfish, and wrong. But it also taught me lessons I might never have learned otherwise, that every tradition deserves respect, that our choices have consequences, and that true strength lies in owning up to our mistakes." As he spoke, Charles noticed a familiar figure standing quietly near the back of the room. It was the royal guard, the same one he had poured paint on all those years ago. Their eyes met briefly, and though no words were exchanged, Charles felt a sense of peace wash over him. The guard gave a slight nod, a gesture so subtle that most people in the room likely missed it. But to Charles, it meant everything, a quiet acknowledgement that his efforts toward redemption had not gone unnoticed. By the end of the speech, the room erupted into applause. Many attendees approached Charles afterward, congratulating him on his courage and thanking him for his honesty. Among them was the palace representative, who handed him a small token of appreciation, a framed photograph of the palace guards, signed by each member of the unit. Beneath the signatures was a simple message: respect earned, lessons shared. Leaving the palace that evening, Charles felt a profound sense of closure. He knew he would always carry the weight of his past mistakes, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they fueled his mission to educate and inspire others. As he stepped onto the street, the cool London air brushing against his face, Charles smiled softly to himself. He wasn't the same man who had arrived in this city years ago, seeking thrills and validation. He was someone new, someone who had turned his greatest failure into a foundation for lasting change. And as he disappeared into the crowd, blending seamlessly with the flow of tourists and locals alike, Charles realized something extraordinary. Redemption wasn't about erasing your past. It was about using it to build a better future.